When it comes to crazy, I am flight. You know, the psychological and physical response to danger, fight or flight, and I think they've even added a third, freeze. Well, last weekend was super weird for me, but I realized when Saturday and Sunday were over that I am flight. Let's start with Saturday. I was signed up to attend an interfaith religious tour of Kansas City, mosques, Hindu temples, synagogues, and more. I was excited to learn more about KC, learn about the different strands of Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism in this town, and of course sample the culturally appropriate snacks and meet the priests and rabbis, etc. However, when only one other person showed up, a lovely woman there on behalf of her employer, the Truman Library, we found a very different experience before us. Long story short, the day ended at the first stop. The guide made us take off our shoes and then look in through the window of the mosque. The other woman with me shook her head and said our guide's name over and over again, maybe in disgust, maybe in pity. She put back on her shoes in the vestibule and took a phone call on her cell. I, on the other hand, threw my feet into my shoes, didn't tie the laces, and scurried out to my car. I began furiously texting Schaefer's babysitter, my sister who was supposed to take over, and my boss, who is Brian, updating them that the tour was a fluke. I'm coming home. Try and get a refund. This is a scam. Then the Truman Library employee came over to my car, and I rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You seemed a little shaken in there." It was then that I realized I was shaking, and I was tense, and my breathing was short, and I felt afraid that Brian would be mad at me, and I wanted out of the situation. I was suddenly 17 years old, standing outside the door of a party where I knew there was going to be drugs and alcohol, wishing my friend would just take me home so I wouldn't feel so vulnerable or at risk of upsetting my parents. Suddenly, I was 10 years old when a stranger in a car parked on the side of my street offered to take me to a place where there were lots of animals for me to look at, after which he opened his door and casually swung his legs out of the car. Suddenly, I was 3 years old when the neighbor boy took me to his special playhouse. Triggers, trauma, fear. And on Saturday, I found myself in flight. Was there imminent danger on the tour? No, not really. But I hauled out of there anyway and learned something new. I respond with flight. But that's not the important part of the story. I only realized that about myself because someone asked if I was okay. I was wondering, where do you hurt? A stranger came over to my car in a culture where ringing the wrong doorbell can get a black kid shot. And she checked on me. "You good?" she asked. And knowing I was there doing continuing education for a church job, she assured me that we were there for a reason and that there was no need to be afraid. God said, "There's no need to be afraid," she told me. I nodded at her and took some deep breaths, rolled up my window as she walked away, and started my car to head back home. Where do you hurt? On Sunday, a no less strange event occurred. Mom was under the weather and Manuel was in North Carolina, so Dad, Schaefer, and I headed to Chipotle for lunch after church. When we arrived, the line was out the door, but we stayed. While waiting, Jackson and Grace passed us by and we said hello and bantered, wishing that we had gotten there early as they did. For 45 minutes, we waited in that line, watching other people interact, watching the restaurant patrons eat. In my mind, I noted how many people were on their phones, who was probably on a date, which mom looked really over it already, who was still wearing their Chiefs sweatshirt instead of switching to the Royals, and more. When we finally reached the front of the counter 45 minutes later, the door chimes rang again, and already in the habit, I turned around to see who the next guest on our list of lingerers in line for fake Mexican food was going to be. It was a young, light-skinned woman of color in a vibrant t-shirt, and by her side, a young white man, very skinny, sort of hunched over, wearing a black t-shirt tucked into a pair of jeans. And around his waist, a holster with a handgun. Oh my God. Y'all, I come from Texas, where it's also open carry, but it should be noted that I come from Austin, where the guns are tastefully small and hidden, and quite frankly, I can't see them, so for me, eating with my family, ignorance is bliss. But here I was in a fast food restaurant with my vulnerable son at a table playing with cars and listening to a kid's science YouTube video, halfway between me and the gun. Not to mention my vulnerable elderly father getting ready to order a burrito bowl from his favorite restaurant. I know, Dad, you're not vulnerable and you're not elderly, whatever. I'm telling a story here. In hushed tones, I explained the situation to my father. I told him we would be getting our food to go. I ordered mine and Schaefer's food and grimaced when they dropped Schaefer's quesadilla on the floor and had to start his order over. How many more minutes or seconds until I could get my kid and Dad out of there? Now, I come from a family of farmers. I have watched my grandpa, may he rest in peace, shoot a groundhog from the second-story window with a rifle. My extended family shoots deer and pheasants and eats the meat. My mother learned the hard way as a child that raccoons will cease to be pets as soon as they get into the neighbor's corn. But none of these are the reasons I left the fast food restaurant. I am traumatized by school shootings, starting with Columbine when I was in college and ending never. Add that to the shooting of kids who rang the wrong doorbell, turned their car around in the wrong driveway, approached the wrong car in a grocery store parking lot, and I feel subjugated to fear. Gun violence is the white witch in Narnia, whose Turkish delights promise power and domination. I will do whatever it takes to not have the white witch turn her rage against my child. I was wondering, where do you hurt? If we are ever to be people who bring peace and healing to this hurting world, we must be willing to pause and bear witness to our pain and to others' pain. Is it fascinating to hear about my weekend, my stories, my hurt, my fear? Good. I hope your curiosity is rooted in knowing that we are all connected, and we can only cultivate connection by being honest with one another. So I started. Your turn. If your neighbor turned to you right now, over the fence or across the front porch, and asked, "Where do you hurt?" And if you don't have societal pressures to come across a certain way, if you don't have a fear of being misunderstood by answering that difficult question, or if you don't have a stranglehold on hope that steers you clear of your emotions, how would you answer? How would you answer if you didn't have to follow up with the words, "Oh, sorry, that was dark. Oh, sorry for crying. Sorry for burdening you," or any other self-loathing and anti-vulnerability statements that our culture requires in its quest for stoicism and strength? And what about those of you doing the questioning? Some of us can't even bring ourselves to allow this question to dribble out of our mouths, let alone answer it for ourselves. If that's the case, we must confess the harm done in neglecting the emotional, physical, individual, historical, and systematic wounds that exist among us. In the book of Samuel, Hannah has been belittled, patronized, and provoked for her infertility, a bodily condition over which she has no control. Some of us, like Hannah, may be all too familiar with the pain of infertility. Others of us carry the secret sufferings of child loss, postpartum depression, sickness, layoffs, economic insecurity, or addiction. What would we say if someone stopped to ask us, "Where does it hurt?" And that someone actually acknowledged the validity of our answers? But no one asks Hannah that, at least not right away. Hannah's sister wife, yes, they were polygamous, Penninah, is a real piece of work. She shows no source of comfort, but quite the opposite. Hannah's husband, Elkanah, showers gifts upon her and whines that he should be enough to make Hannah happy. But that doesn't seem to help either. Shocker. Even the temple priest, Eli, writes her off. "Go on, get out of here now. Sober up and head home. It's after hours and we don't need your shame on display tonight." I offer the loose translation of his words as, "We like ritualistic, short, quiet prayers, and certainly not prayers that show emotion. This is not a Pentecostal temple, Hannah. When have I been Penninah? Whose pain have I mocked? When was I Elkanah? Whose pain did I question? And when was I Eli? Whose pain have I dismissed?" I have been each of those people, and then I remember that I have been Hannah too. And I look for who right now is screaming in my little world. Everyone carries hurt and has the capacity to acknowledge the pain of others. Let me repeat that. Everyone carries hurt, and everyone has the capacity to acknowledge the pain of others. In order to cultivate connection, we must first be curious about the pain others carry and the pain we carry ourselves. Before we can act, we must first acknowledge and believe that pain is real. To cultivate compassion, we must bear witness to each other's pain. There are two extremes underlying our motivation to ask, "Where do you hurt?" Just as dismissal and bullying add to Hannah's pain, so do the opposite end of the thread impede honesty and vulnerability. So to review, pain can be overlooked by way of neglect, Eli, mockery, Penninah, self-aggrandizement, Elkanah, but it can also be exploited by way of voyeurism, that's satisfaction from another's pain, like Sarah had over Hagar in Genesis. It can be exploited by way of gossip. Did you hear about her? Like Judah did with Tamar. And again, self-aggrandizement. I'm better than her. Sarah and Judah could both be accused of this. So it's no wonder we hold our cards to ourselves. Vulnerability is risky. To acknowledge our own pain and hurting is to find ourselves praying at the steps of whatever we hold sacred: the church, a work of art, a job, or a bottle of liquor, praying and begging to be released from the pain. Vulnerability is risky. To open ourselves to the pain and hurt of others is to acknowledge that pain exists. And if your theme song is Happy by Pharrell Williams or Shiny Happy People by the B-52s, this is going to be very difficult for you. Beyond that, what if we learn that the hurt is actually something we caused? What if the hurt is something we benefit from? Ooh, well, that is uncomfortable. Where do you hurt? We are invited to ask. Where do you hurt? Someone might ask back. My child's preschool dismisses at 12:30, and it's located on a small hill and grassy area that the kids run around on after school. Inevitably, one of the kids falls, and regardless of whether or not that child is crying, you'll hear a parent say to their own child, "Sweetie, ask your friend if they're okay. Honey, go check on your friend and ask if they're all right." I can't wait to see the culture of compassion these kids create when they grow up. With the 5-year-old child of a playwright and an actor sitting in the back seat of my car every day, spoiler alert, it's my own child, I hear a lot of kids' musicals on repeat. Schaefer's current favorite is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, starring Christian Borle, and y'all, I am more traumatized by this story as an adult than I was even as a teen. But his second favorite musical right now is Matilda. And if you're in in-person church, you'll get to hear the song that I'm going to be referencing. In the musical, all the children manifest in this song, "When I Grow Up," about what they will do when they're big enough to climb trees, have autonomy to eat all the sweets they want in a day. And then it's like ironic foreshadowing for the audience as the children sing, "When I grow up, I will be strong enough to carry all the heavy things you have to haul around with you when you're a grown up." Ooh, child. No. You will not be strong enough. That rally cry that God will never give you more than you can handle is a loose translation of a book written 2,000 years ago in a historic foreign language. The writer of Corinthians is writing about sinning. There's a bunch of sexual shenanigans happening in the verses before this. He's writing about sinning, not suffering. So now, don't crucify me, but the mantra, "God will never give you more than you can handle," is a bunch of malarkey, or at the very least, it's not scriptural. But that's okay. And maybe that's the point. We aren't supposed to handle everything by ourselves. We aren't meant to exist in this world alone. What God did give us was and is each other. And so we are called to ask, where does it hurt? Of one another and of ourselves. Throughout the musical, Matilda repeats this thought. Just because you think that life's not fair, it doesn't mean that you just have to grin and bear it. If you always take it on the chin and wear it, nothing will change. Just because I find myself in this story, it doesn't mean that everything is written for me. If I think the ending is fixed already, I might as well be saying, I think that it's okay. And that's not right. No, it's not. The ending isn't fixed. You don't have to bottle up your emotions and submit to fear. You don't have to fight, flee, or freeze. You don't have to pretend you don't feel things. In fact, only in acknowledging the hurt can we begin the healing process. But the healing process doesn't progress with the biting words of Penninah, the pretend it's not happening selfishness of Elkanah, or the dismissal of Eli. It starts with, I've been meaning to ask, where does it hurt? Amen.